very warm welcome to this workshop titled Exploring Tools for Inclusive and Sustainable Decision Making for Our Economy. So it's kindly hosted by the Oxfordshire Inclusive Economy Partnership, OIEP, and this event is very kindly supported by the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And I just want to start by saying a big thank you to Emma from the OIEP team for supporting and organising this event. So just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Paul Roberts. In my day job, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aspire, a local housing and employment charity, and I also sit on the steering group of the and I have a few other hats, such as being the director of the Oxfordshire Social Enterprise Partnership. So lots of hats, lots of things, and lots of parts. But a lot of the narratives and themes for this evening all very supportive of those roles and responsibilities. So I'm really pleased to be able to be a part of this event. And it's going to be a really lively and enriching discussion, I'm sure. I just want to run through a few housekeeping points briefly first, and then we'll crack on with the event. So, filming and photography. So we will be doing some filming, but it's the speakers only and the presentations only. So we'll have discussions, FAQs, informal conversations. That's not going to be recorded. It's just the presentation, so we can share the slides and the learning more widely afterwards. Photography, there will be some group shot photos rather than aiming at specific people. Hoping that's fine. But if that is an issue, just let one of the team know, let myself know, and we'll make sure that they are not included in any photos that come out. Fire exits, one that way and another that way. Refreshments, a big thank you to Damascus Rose Kitchen Social Enterprise. Lovely food. As always, very reliable partner. Plenty left, it looks like, so please make sure you help yourself around the evening. Wi-Fi access, the best Wi-Fi is OFS guest, and the password is OFS guest. That's one word, no guest. Toilets and washroom facilities, I think you've seen that there's an accessible one just around the corner, just there, closest. And the theatre is equipped with a hearing loop system. That's the housekeeping. So back to the purpose of this evening's workshop and the agenda for the evening. So the main point is to share learning so we can improve our understanding and encourage working collaboratively so that our decision-making tools and processes become more regenerative and sustainable by design. And that in turn will help to make the local economy of Oxfordshire be thriving and generating prosperity in an inclusive way for everyone. So it's a great opportunity for everybody to learn and to get more involved. So the way it's going to work, we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to go straight into it. We're going to start with an introduction to Doughnut Economics and the ways that different places are already engaging with it. And that's courtesy of Eric and Leonora from the team. And then this will be followed by a short activity on the way places such as Oxfordshire can use the tools, followed by a Q&A discussion. And then Eric will then introduce the ways businesses are engaging with the tools as well. And then there'll be another short activity followed by a Q&A. So as you see, there's really lots of time for discussion, some interactive sessions, so we can really sink our teeth into the donuts this evening. You'll see it's the only one I'll do across. And then I'll wrap up towards the end. And we're done. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Eric and Leonora. Thank you very much for coming.
Paul promised that there won't be any more puns around donuts, but I didn't make any such promise. So we are going to introduce you to what we claim to be the only donut that's actually good for you. But we're going to do it through the lens of thinking about what is regenerative and what is distributive. And just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm Eric Sahan. I lead the work at Doughnut Economics Action Lab on bringing the concepts of doughnut economics to the world of business, particularly through the lens of how do we unlock the most ambitious actions possible, the most ambitious strategies possible across the world of business. I have a background working on social enterprise, cooperatives, as well as big companies for the last 20 years. And I've got various sort of hats alongside my Doughnut Economics hat. But today we're going to focus on that. So I'm going to introduce it briefly. But a lot of it stems, well, all of it stems from this book that you see behind me. Written by Oxford's very own Kate Raworth, our colleague and friend who wrote about 8 years ago now, the book Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And those 7 ways are listed there. Now we're going to particularly focus on number 5 and number 6. Design to distribute and create to regenerate. Now those 2 underpin and hopefully unlock some really ambitious actions from local government as well as from the business world. So we're going to introduce those concepts. But of course, it's a more holistic picture. And to sort of give a sense of who we are as an organisation and where some of this energy is building, the map behind me gives a sense of the different change makers around the world, whether it's local government actors, whether it's companies, consultancies, networks, local community organisations, activists, educators of all kinds that have sort of joined this global community saying, hey, Doughnut Economics is something that is helpful for us in our work. It's not helpful everywhere. It's not helpful in every context. So we sort of have this premise of going where the energy is. And where there's energy, we try to help, we try to support and provide resources, tools, and some guidance. And if you are one of those places that feels like, hey, this is a concept and a tool that is helpful to the work we're doing, you're not alone. You'd be among at least 70 local governments around the world, cities, regions, local authorities that have embarked upon this and thought this is helpful for us to transform our local place. Leonora is going to go into the details of some of this, but this is where the energy is, this is where we're trying to service, to support those local change makers that are driving this change. Now, we're also trying to build a broader narrative shift, and that narrative shift is happening across global political leadership, among local and national media, among thought leaders from David Attenborough to the Pope, to the King of Bhutan, to the President of Ireland. We've had quite a bit of people saying, hey, this is some new language, these are some new tools. And what I would underline to maybe introduce these ideas to you all today is that it helps us overcome some of the ideological battlegrounds of the 20th century, some of the linguistic things that we've held on to and makes it so much more difficult for us to find common ground. What we focus a lot on is the action. The term Action Lab is very deliberate in our name. So what is it actually that we agree on trying to generate? And I think that in a room like this and in most rooms that we engage with, we find this huge amount of agreement. There are disagreements on terminology on whether that indicator is, a proxy for these other things or not. And this is why we talk about being agnostic to growth, for instance. That's one of those 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. In the words of my colleague and friend Kate Raworth, the 20th century built an economy that must grow GDP whether or not humans and the living world thrive. And we now need to build an economy that thrives whether or not GDP goes up or not. And if you're a fan of GDP being a fantastic proxy for all the great social and ecological goals that need to be pursued, then great. If by pursuing those, there will be an uptick in GDP. If you don't think those 2 things are positively correlated, then that's fine too. So the agnosticism helps us maybe put down some of those older 20th century debates and think about, right, where's the action we need? Because we agree on so much. And this is the centrality of really the observation. And it began when I was working with Kate at Oxfam over 10 years ago now, where she basically looked at the work of Earth system scientists that said, hey, we've got 9 planetary boundaries, that these are the boundaries we must not transgress, we must not be an overshoot of. But she sort of made the observation that, hey, it's not just about staying within those ecological ceilings, but also to look at the social foundation. Sorry about that, this is coming back up. And the social foundation, when that comes back up, is that inner concentric circle. The inner concentric circle that helps quantify what are the essentials of life,
what are the social needs? What do we need for all of us to live good lives that are thriving, that are creating well-being, that are allowing us to, thank you, Leonora, to have an economy that works for all. So hopefully this will show back up. But unfortunately, the cliffhanger I was about to create for the next slide, and I was going to ask people here in showing this slide, maybe if you click slideshow, Leonora, it would still. Well, let's try it. I do, but it's in not a great format. There we go. Okay, so this is the global picture. We are both in overshoot on majority of the planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have said. These are things that work in balance to create a balanced living planet. And we're falling short on life's essentials. So this is essentially a bit of a collective selfie of humanity. This is the social and ecological systems that we have created that are driving us into overshoot, driving us into shortfall. And I think everybody here would agree we need an economy that lives within the parameters of Earth's life supporting systems while meeting the needs of everybody and helping society thrive. And that's sort of the goal. Now, the question I'm going to adapt to create a little bit of a cliffhanger is, who thinks there are some countries that might be close to this? Can you put your hand up if you think there are some? All right, we've got some guesses over here. Does anyone want to shout out a country that might be coming close to living within the donut? Bhutan? Any other guesses? Go. Costa Rica? Any other guesses? Well, unfortunately, Paul, you were right. That's the country that comes closest to being in the donut. It's not quite. But imagine if we made those economic transformations at a global level to support that sort of goal. And these are just some select pictures to demonstrate what this looks like at national level. That we have created economies that are reliant on huge overshoot on the fair share of the world's planetary boundaries in order to meet a lot of the human needs. It looks the same if you swap in Scandinavia. A lot of high-income countries, this is the story we get. The middle-income countries, that's the story we get. They're fast running towards that outcome. And the lower-income countries, the so-called global south, whether it's Malawi or other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South America, South and Southeast Asia, we get a picture where actually they're not using their fair share of the planet's resources and falling even more short on life's essentials for their people. So something's broken. We're all essentially developing countries now. We're all in a period of transition, of development and of a trajectory. And there's one more concept I want to throw at you from the book before I start moving into something a bit more practical, which is this concept of the embedded economy. Because so much of economics has been about, look, the Earth serves society, society serves the economy. And if we flip that around and think, well, actually the economy serves society, it's within society. And society is part of the living world, that we must respect the balances and the boundaries of the living world. Then we start to really flip on its head some of the 20th century conventional economics and go, how do we create an economy that can work like this? Now, you might have noticed that the economy as well has got those 4 quadrants in it. The household, the market, the commons, the state. And a lot of 20th century economics has been about the market or the state, and has forgotten the fact that we've got a huge amount of economic activity going on within the household. Think of the caring economy. Think of all the things we're doing with family and friends, as well as the commons. If we think about all the volunteering that's going on, all the community organizations, there's a lot of economic activity that goes on, not least in buildings like this. That's not necessarily captured by the market or the state. And in the market, we're maybe consumers, producers, we're labor or capital providers, and in the state, we might be public servants, residents, voters, protesters, representatives, as there are some in this room. In the economy, we might be parents, partners, we might be a relative, a child, or we might be a volunteer or a sharer, a co-creator, a steward of local resources in the commons. So these are all aspects of the economy that are working together. There's a whole host of things that matter if you're in one quadrant or the other. If you're in the market, then it's convenience and competitiveness and profitability. If you're in the economy, of the household, you're in generosity and care and love and nurture. If you're in the economy of the state, it's about fairness and democracy and rights, etc. And if you're in the commons, then it's about collaboration and cooperation and sharing all the things that make local communities work. And once we start to think in this way and think, well, we've got to make all aspects of the economy thrive, we start to open up the imagination of what's possible. Now, back to this picture. Hopefully you're feeling alarmed. Hopefully you're feeling somewhat unsafe that we live on a planet that we are stretching beyond this carrying capacity. It's this little blip of the last 60 or 70 years that has created this huge overuse of fossil fuels and other natural resources that has created this huge overshoot as well as the shortfall on life's essentials. Well, let's quickly unpack what is driving this. So part of it is we've created an ecologically degenerative model of production, trade, and consumption, where we take from Earth its resources, we make stuff with it, we use it, then we lose it, and we repeat this over and over again. In fact, we've created economies where if we reduce the growth of consumption, the result is often a recession, so we go into a crisis. So there's an addiction to this, and we haven't been anywhere near able to decouple the ecological impact of economic activity from the economy itself. So there's this strong coupling, and maybe someday in the future we'll have fantastic technologies that achieve this. But at the moment, the greater the consumption, the greater the degenerative models that we have created. But there is hope, and there is a way to move towards a much more regenerative economy that is working with and within the cycles of the living world. And that's a really central concept. I mean, partly it comes from the idea of the circular economy. So part of you might have noticed that, like, how do we create loops for both biological materials and technical materials that are flowing and that are minimizing the loss of heat and matter? I'm going to describe that in a second. It's also partly inspired by the idea of biomimicry. This idea that says that, hey, we've had, 3.8 billion years of evolution, and the way the planet and living creatures have designed themselves over time through evolution. There's a wisdom in that, there's a balance in that, there's no waste in nature. If this building wasn't here, we had wildland instead. That wildland would be sequestering carbon, it would be cleaning the groundwater, it would be cleaning the air, it would be creating shade on hot summer days for local mammals and other species. It would be actively creating benefits. So how do we work with and within the cycles of the living world? A couple of quick ideas on this. It's about going from that degenerative model, where we are actively degrading nature, getting maybe as a stepping stone to a sustainable model, which is minimizing the harm that we're doing, but also going beyond that and going to regenerative and thinking about how do we repair some of the damage that we've done. Same thing goes for the way we design our products. We build products that every couple of years we throw out. We could get to recyclable, but actually what we want to do is go all the way back to the way we design products, to design out waste so that things are repairable, they're modular. We eliminate waste in the way everything is designed. And this is a transformation that's possible, but it requires ambition and it requires significant effort. Now, the other flip side of this is we also need socially distributive models. And by that, what we mean is models that are sharing opportunity much more equitably with all who co-created. Many of you would see the annual stats that organizations like Oxfam are producing to demonstrate the growth of inequality, of income and wealth inequality year on year. Some alarming figures again in this year's one, but essentially, if we want to reverse that growth of economic inequality, then we need to, for instance, think of how do we design distributive energy systems that are, you could go to fossil fuel, or we can include people into access to renewable energy through more centralized, large-scale renewables, and there's a huge role for that. But how do we prioritize community ownership of renewable energy, for instance, through the kind of systems and mechanisms and initiatives in this county and beyond? The same goes for wages. I mean, I spent more than 10 years working on wages in global supply chains. I know how difficult achieving a living wage is, particularly in global supply chains. But I think the ambition needs to go beyond and think, well, we don't want to just get to the minimum, including people in ways that's sufficient for them. But how do we build it so that they get the upside, that we share some of the upside of success much more equitably? For instance, through models like John Lewis's profit distribution model to its own workers. So I'm going to pause there and let Leonora introduce the first activity. Leonora?
Let's see if I can use this as well as I can. Thanks. Thanks, Erin, to quickly introduce myself. I'm the Cities and Regions Lead and colleague of Erin at the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. So I'm the person that works and supports the local and regional governments on all scales, from towns and villages to mega cities, that explore and put into practice these ideas of Doughnut economics. So the next part of the presentation will go down from the big concepts and ideas to the pragmatic practicalities of everyday policy making and strategy making in local governments. But before we move to that, we're going to do a very quick kind of activity and a bit of a reflection moment to get us settled down into the local scale, into Oxfordshire. So to remind ourselves of this selfie of humanity, the global donut, we're going to do a quick experiment in designing a quick Oxfordshire donut here in this table. So we're going to invite you to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes using this very sophisticated technology that we have available, red and green sticky dots, to map out your own perceptions of how Oxfordshire is doing right now. So essentially, this selfie of humanity is a bit of an answer through the lenses of Doughnut economics of how are we doing as humanity right now. And one of the core ways of using these concepts at a local scale is to be asking that question: how are we doing as a city right now, through the lens of the well-being of humanity and the thriving of nature. So we have a bit of an adapted donut here, so that we focus on what can be on those local aspects of the ecology on the outer side and the social foundations. So we're essentially going to ask you to express how you feel Oxfordshire is currently doing in meeting the needs of people, getting them access to food, to health, to education, employment, safety, political voice, social equity, quality and diversity, housing, community, mobility, and access to water. Those are the aspects of the social foundation. And then we have the local ecology and our impact on the planetary boundaries. So we have greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy use, circular economy and waste, soil health, water waste health, flood risk and erosion, land use, and then the impact of land use on wild habitats and biodiversity, air quality, and green space. So if you feel that this place is currently doing well in your use and mobilization of renewable energy, then put a green sticky dots in the safe and just space of humanity. If you feel like you're probably going to overshoot, a red sticky dot on the outside, and the same for the social foundation. A green sticky dot inside if you feel you're doing well on education, or a red sticky dot kind of falling in the hole there. So since this is a very, and we have 5 minutes, so and a lot of people here, there's no need to express your perception on everything. You may have strong feelings and experiences or knowledge in some places, or gut feeling, and you may not have anything to come up with in this 1 minute time that we're being given in terms of other things without being data available. So go where the energy takes you, and let's see what kind of selfie we come up with for Oxfordshire. So we're gonna spend the next, but I'm gonna, you can just, you know what, you can just place them here, so that people can just grab their own. Just invite everybody to, in a chaotic but orderly manner, approach. Right. Thank you everybody for playing with us there and for creating the first ever Oxfordshire donut. And I think there's some areas where you will see, and obviously this is a perception-based exercise and not a data-based exercise. So there will be areas where different people will have this different perception, but there are also areas where there's very strong alignment with everybody thinking that the county is falling short on housing, or the overshooting and falling short on water waste health, on soil health, on flood risk and erosion, on greenhouse gas emissions, on health and education, more or less. So this becomes a bit of a starting point of a conversation about a place through the lenses of Doughnut Economics. However, this isn't, and I hope that it was a bit of a moment of reflection. However, this wasn't, of course, a rigorous exercise and a rigorous way to be downscaling this concept and this global donut to the scale of places, of towns, of regions, of cities, because what it really means to be holding those regenerative and distributive ambitions in mind and downscaling through actions the donut, we need to take into considerations not only the local aspirations, but also our global responsibilities and our global connections. And this is why we have this concept and this framework that we use as a starting point for places to engage with the ideas of Doughnut Economics, which we call the Doughnut Unrolled. And starting from this question, what would it mean for a place to live in the donut? How can we, as places, start turning that image around, start turning those red sticky dots into red ones? And it all really starts with these guiding questions. How can our place become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And this big question holds in it four different questions, looking at what we call the four lenses of the downscale of the unrolled donut. Because when we zoom in, we have not only the social foundation and the ecological ceiling of the donut, but also on the left of these two axes of our local aspirations and our global responsibilities. So it asks four guiding questions. The local social, how can all the people of our place thrive? And this is about the well-being and the needs, the safety, the happiness, the health of all the people living in our places. The second lens, the local ecological lens, asks how can our place be as generous as nearby nature? How can we give back to nature, restore and regenerate our local ecologies? Drawing from these ideas that Erich was sharing about biomimicry and recognizing that we should be positively contributing parts of the ecosystems that we build our human settlements in. So how can we take care of our local ecology and match nature's wisdom and cleanse the air and house biodiversity and store carbon and cycle water and harvest energy through the ways in which we build and design and we plan our cities and our economies? How can we be of service to local nature as well? But then we zoom out and we look at our global responsibilities and our global connections. And we look at this global ecological lens, asking how can our place respect the health of the whole planet? And this is about recognizing the impact of our actions here on those planetary boundaries. How do our transport modes, our production, our consumption, the products we use, the houses we build, the lifestyles we live, the food we consume, how do all of these choices and ways of working and ways of building the local economies impact and put pressure on those planetary boundaries, on climate change, on chemical pollution, on biodiversity loss, etc. And the fourth lens, the very often invisible lens throughout not only policy but I feel society, is this global social lens, asking how can our place respect the well-being of all people? And this is about recognizing that all of the things in this globally connected world, so much of the action we take here has impact on communities elsewhere. This microphone we use, all these chairs and tables, where was those materials extracted from? What was the impact on that ecology and the livelihoods of those communities? What were the conditions of all the workers throughout the supply chains? And all the impacts outside of our place where we live that we have through our actions here, whether it's through policies and learning networks, whether it's through supply chains and procurement policies. So these are the four lenses of the downscale donut that we invite as a starting point of using these concepts at a local scale, and that they can become an entry point to thinking about policies and strategies and plans and neighborhood as a holistic lens of thinking and of working. And we have many tools that we create at the Doughnut Economics Action Lab built based on this framework as well. And one of these tools focuses specifically on creating a data portrait of a place. So essentially on creating that image over there, but based on data. And the way that methodology works is looking at each of these lenses, and each of them has all of these themes underneath. for each of the teams, we're asking, what is your current target? Looking at income and work here. What is your place? What is Oxfordshire's target about income and work? And for instance, you have a target, and these targets can be, as you're well aware, across various strategies, visions, policies, often disconnected or living with different authorities and public agencies, or sometimes in a kind of a single vision document. But maybe you have a target that by 2030 there will be no residents living under the poverty line in our place. And then we ask, what is the best available performance indicator that you currently have with which you're measuring how well you're meeting that target? You seeing through the work of many places, so often there are visions that aren't matched by actual measurement indicators. And so it's not often easy to fill in the gaps of this question. But this methodology invites us to look at all of this stuff. Oops. What did I do? Looking at all the themes in each of the lenses and answering these two questions across the four lenses, and essentially create, this is the example of Barcelona, this sort of image showing us how well we're currently doing through these four lenses, eventually re-rolling this back into the donut where we're holding both those local aspirations and global responsibilities and showing our state of place in a way, and showing our impact locally and globally. So this is one of the methodologies that we have at the lab. And in reality, places, local governments working with Doughnut Economics often use as a starting point some of the many tools and methodologies we have, often start innovating on their own with the concepts and the ideas coming from the group. So the practice is very fluid and emergent from both the existing tools and the experimentation in action of many places. And so I'm just going to glimpse through some examples of how this is looking like in practice in some different places like that. Of course, we will share ways for you to learn a lot more about this. But based on this idea of kind of measuring, comparing targets against indicators and seeing the state of a place, this is a starting point for many places. So creating this data portrait, this is Yerevan in Armenia, this is the data portrait of Brussels region. Both took very different approach. In Yerevan, they brought in they did a community engagement and based a lot of the targets on the perceptions of citizens as well. In Brussels, they're hoping to look into ways to track this into the next decades as well. So this is the beginning point, and many places have used this as a base of creating a monitor and kind of a regular state of a place, maybe annually assessing trajectory, assessing how you're currently doing. Some places have also used it as a starting point for creating future plans and future scenarios. This is part of Mexico City's development plan for 2040, where they started with building their own contextualized donut of Mexico City right now, and then they developed, based on data and on modeling, two scenarios of 2040 Mexico City donut, how it could look like were a certain number of policies and actions implemented on the top, and how could it look like in 2040 if they continue with business as usual and the plans as they currently are. And they used it mostly as a conversation and a communication tool as well. They found it was a powerful way to communicate complex ideas with citizens and with stakeholders. We're talking rather about 200 pages of policies that are hard to digest, really showing the potential impact of policies or lack thereof. In other places, this is in Cornwall's plan to 2050, they developed an outcomes framework in their vision plan that was based again on contextualized and adapted social and ecological indicators and their own Cornwall donut. And they're using the baselines and the targets that they're setting to kind of continue setting direction and to annually review how they're currently doing. So we'll see this traffic light system of, are we meeting our target? Are we significantly off target? Are we slightly below target? And this is from their last 2023 review showing through the lenses of donut, how well they're meeting their targets and needs. And of course, there's a lot of benefits to using this sort of visual frameworks, and there's a lot of hidden ambition under how and where we set our targets as well. Because of course, we can all be doing green if we set our targets very, very low, if there aren't really regenerative and distributive, and we can just congratulate ourselves. Or we can be, as many places are doing, co-creating those targets as well with citizens. We can be basing them on planetary boundaries wherever possible, etc. But it isn't an exact science, of course, as you know. It is a very fluid thing to be talking and talking about and setting targets. This is Beacon's National Park in Wales, and they've used Doughnut at the core of their management plan. They've developed kind of a current state of the park Doughnut that informs, kind of starts with that understanding of how they're currently doing, and from that they built core missions. So they've taken a mission approach, and they've built out 5 core missions based on the areas where they're doing most poorly. And they're doing a similar thing as well in Copenhagen, where they're using these red wedges to say, right, where do we need to take most urgent actions? Where are we having most problems, and we need to be prioritizing our policies in that direction. In other places, so this was one way. Many places are using, this approach of using the Doughnut and ideas of Doughnut economics as a strategic and unifying compass in various ways, and it looks very differently from place to place. Bretton Beacons did it in one way. In Nanaimo in Canada, they use Doughnut economics as what they call a unifying framework. So really the idea of stitching together all the different pieces of work that are happening in often disjointed sectors and departments of the council. To quote one of the councillors that led this work, he said, we have so many great strategies and policies, but sometimes they not only don't talk to each other, they actively undermine and contradict each other. And we needed to start making them work together for each other and towards a common goal. And we use this framework to start doing that, stitching the story together. And yet another example of a different way that it has been brought into practice, again from Cornwall, but not the only place that is taking the approach, is designing this impact assessment tools, where you're kind of designing projects and talking about the potential negative or positive outcomes of project, not based on 3 areas of a checklist that sometimes are very limited depending on the place, not based on the cost benefit analysis, but based on the potential impact on people in the place and on the environment. So there's this wheel with the far red, green being a long-lasting positive impact and a long-term negative impact, that immediately visualizes and opens the discussion on how to direct and improve or change or not even adopt certain projects and policies that are visibly have negative impact on the long term and on the short term, as in this other region in France they're also experimenting. So these are just some kind of a glimpse through some potential and some existing case studies in the world of local and regional governments. There's been this guide that I invite you, if you're interested, to dive into, and we've kind of identified these 9 ways in which local governments are getting started with these ideas, because they really vary quite a lot, and there isn't a single pathway, and it isn't a step-by-step process. So some may be just testing these ideas on already ongoing projects. Some may be designing entire new compasses. Some may be doing demonstrator projects, and all these different ways to either deeply adopt new transformative ideas or experiment and test the waters on where the stakes are lower, that you can glimpse through in this guide. And just to wrap up this part, I'm sharing some of the early learning, what has been some of the biggest pool that local regional governments places share with us of why they ended up starting kind of to explore these concepts. And they've been, one, having kind of the tools and the pathways and the language and the narrative for a new transformative agenda, for a new way to talk about the future, a new way to talk about ideas. many, the key reason has been that it's a holistic framework that has helped them bridge silos internally within departments, between departments, and kind of start work across departments rather than in separate things. And for others, yet, it has been about the potential to unite different interests and players externally as well as internally. So cross bridges between local government and civil sector, or between the social and ecological conversations that can sometimes take up very separate things. For others, it's been often the potential to measure ways to measure progress and set visions, or the strong visualization that has been helpful for organization, for communication, for simplification of ideas. And finally, this narrative of hope that ultimately the Doughnut brings us, because yes, we see a very grim self-care humanity, but we're talking about being a generation of change makers that we start turning it around, that actually has the information and knowledge and ways and pathways forward to change it. So I will stop there and Q&A, and we'll have just a bit of time because we're running out of schedule in 5 or 10 minutes for any questions, thoughts, comments. Yes. Content, I hope so. Expensive how to explain the concepts, and obviously you work with a number of areas and systems around the world. But what I was particularly interested in is measurement and time frames, because actually some of these things you can see, degradation can happen quite quickly, but how quickly can people turn that around? What kind of time frames do those things you work on to? Got any examples of that? That's a really core question, I would say, because and there are many challenges, and different places are taking different approaches. The challenges are one, often the data and the availability of data, and the capacity to producing fresh and new data on an annual basis, and even the availability of data at your scale of jurisdiction. That for many will be a challenge. So there's, I think, different places work with what they have, and they start with what they have. But equally, we always encourage to not dismiss what you currently don't have. So a big question and challenge that the Doughnut is always opening is, don't take out a wedge just because you don't have the data and knowledge on it right now, or because you don't think you have an issue with food right now. You may in 5 years, and you may have the data, and if you dismiss it, you will never start measuring it again. So I think from many places, and some places, it's also, as you said, the time frames. So some places have also worked with absolute targets. So where do you set your targets? If you currently have 50% of people living under the poverty line, your target should be 0, of course. The target should always be 0. But some places like to take the in-between targets as, okay, let's look at 2030 and what is a realistic reduction within this time frame and with the data we get. So there's always that challenge of working between the time frames and what we can impact. There isn't a clear answer to that, but I think it's almost one of the key questions that one should be asking when you start the process. Sorry, just because I said
can you just go back to the slide that we finished on? That's the next one. This one here. Yeah. So
That's just
that's the next one. I was going to say, I was reading that thinking, well, we've been talking about place-based and the local government. It's just an obvious question. Okay, that's chapter 2. Perfect. Thank you.
That's right. We didn't just put a slide in there.
It's funny. My question is probably sort of builds on that a bit, because I think most local authorities or regional governments really sort of overestimate their ability to implement things. Actually, it's the private sector that's actually out there charging away and doing stuff. So, are there some good examples where those local areas have worked with the private sector, in particular, to help get their heads around this concept and actually done something to support it?
Well, I'll leave Aaron to reflect a bit more on the ideas of business specifically, but there are certainly examples that maybe coming out from various places where they're using the starting point of Doughnut Economics as a galvanizing, bringing together, partnership building kind of thing. So they've been doing it in Brussels a bit as a unifying conversation of how we can all collaborate together. We started this thing in Amsterdam that they've been also doing in Grenoble, where they introduced this idea of donut deals, where two or more organizations, in the case of Grenoble, it was a local authority, and a network of social enterprises, many private businesses, build this partnership based on the idea of you have to jointly tackle several social challenges and several ecological challenges, and kind of build the joint grounds based on how you're currently doing in a place. So it's been a very useful tool for kind of having those bringing together conversations.
And the big thing I would add to Nori's excellent summary there is that a lot of what we've seen as being some of the more transformative work has been about how they support the kinds of businesses that come into that place and do more of the heavy lifting of the kind of vision that we're setting out here. And that does mean, and I'm going to present in a minute, on some of those models and what that could look like, and also on some of the policies we're using in public procurement much more deliberately and shaping that and thinking about sort of the unintended consequences of some, risk mitigation approaches that shape public procurement that exclude out smaller or certain kinds of enterprises, or models that can use, council-owned property, for instance, to give a leg up for local social enterprises, for local cooperatives, but also then thinking much more broadly about bringing more elements of employee ownership, more elements of locally embedded sort of community-based business structures as well, alongside sort of improving performance of bigger mainstream companies that might be in the region. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit, probably not to full satisfaction, but that's coming up in part two.
Any
last question? Oh, maybe grab two.
Yes, there was, okay. Final.
Thanks very much. I couldn't help noticing that all the examples you gave were from not the UK. I talk quite a number of examples where I've worked. Grenoble is twinned with Oxford. I talked to you're the mayor of Grenoble, occasionally at least. Certainly their model of local government is very, very different to ours, and a lot better in many ways, I would say. In terms of the powers they have, convening powers, and the whole way in which it's set up. One of the things I therefore want to ask you is, what are you doing to influence national government in terms of trying to change the way that local government is viewed in this country, and trying to make sure that actually it is easier for local governments to do some of the convening. Having said all of which, I do think that the OIEP and the work that we're doing locally in terms of local institutions is beginning to make some of the kind of changes through soft power that we haven't necessarily got through hard power. But I think it would be a lot easier if we had some of the kind of enabling powers which the government has in the rest of Europe, for instance.
Absolutely, I think it's quite fair based on all the work I've done with various local government to say that the England local authorities have a more challenging path and more limited jurisdiction than most, more limited powers to raise money, more limited scope of influence. So there's a lot of those enabling and disabling factors, but there are maybe incidentally and Brecon Beacons is in the UK, Glasgow is in the UK, Bath and Somerset, Cornwall is in the UK, so there's quite well, you said the UK. So we're not here for to gossip other parts of England. So there's a lot of interesting work coming up working within the powers of what's possible, and of course. But what we're seeing, to pick up very quickly the national level question, one is we don't really, the way that we work at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is we go where the energy is. So we don't actually go and practically lobby anywhere. We just go where they ask us and support, where they're already doing the work. And there's so much of that happening. There's been less of that happening at a national level scale, but because there's so much attraction at a local, at a regional scale happening, national governments are starting to come to us, including different agencies in England and in the UK, to check what this whole thing is about. And it's something that is working for a lot of local authorities. should we and how should we be paying attention? So let's see.
Yeah, my question was about like the methodology of the tools that you're talking about. At West Oxfordshire, we looked at doing a portrait a year ago-ish, a little bit longer. And we had some metrics and stuff, but what was actually difficult was presenting it in a visual way. You know, that I suppose my question is, do you have, when you say tools and methodologies, are those available for kind of sort of benchmarking and how to score? So you might have a thing that tells you how many people rely on like food passes and stuff. Where do you put the line on the wheel? Is it up there? Is it down here? And so it's that kind of thing where, yeah, do you have those available, or do you work with people on a one-to-one basis to kind of develop it?
We have been attempting to support people on one-to-one because the methodology, if you've attempted, you know that the methodology that we have has its limits and has a long way to go to be able to do this. And we would never be able to do that fully. We would be able to set a guidance on how to contextualize it, but you cannot set the same benchmark for Oxford and for Mexico. But we will be working in the coming months, hopefully in the next 6 months, to kind of advance the methodology to make it way easier to visualize and set those targets, at least have a guiding principle on how to do it so that you don't set the line, as you said. So yeah, good to know.
Thank you. I'm going to now switch to the other side of the fence here and think about business. So we've got 20 minutes before we start wrapping up, and I'm going to you're going to hear my voice for about 10 minutes. I'm going to be as quick as I can, but I am going to throw some additional concepts from the world of business at you. We also prepared a little activity that you can reflect on and jot a few things on as well, but I'm not going to give that yet until I've introduced the core concept. So, Doughnut Economics in the world of business. Firstly, a lot of this is going to be how do we transform business? How do we get the right kinds of companies that can act? Now, I teach at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I work with CEOs of companies around the world. I've run workshops now with over 700 corporates and various size businesses around the world. And my goal in everything I've done in the last few years with those leaders is to look at ways to get the most ambitious possible action. We put the donut on the table and we say, what does your company need to do to help humanity to the donut? Now, what they come up with invariably are quite fundamental transformations in what they do. If they're in fast fashion, they need to move away into slow fashion or regenerative clothing. If they're in the built environment, they need to move away from the kind of structures that have huge ecological impact and create inaccessible pricing for people and potential tenants and buyers. If they're in some of the other sectors like agriculture, there's a huge transformation needed. So the term I'm trying to underline here is that the transformation is huge and daunting for many business leaders, and I know that very well, both from my own students, but also from the people I work with one-to-one and in groups. But we also have lots of approaches, and I just, in this bit, really want to acknowledge different approaches to driving that kind of transformation. I mean, there's a lot of work in terms of regulatory change, in terms of collective action, the use of the role of unions, farmers' organizations, etc. In light of leadership is absolutely critical. We also need to set much better metrics and goals and targets at a company level so that they're meeting these goals, as well as making the business case that, hey, if you want the social license to operate in the year 2030 and beyond, you're going to need to transform quite fundamentally. And as a result, you're going to need to see that for your own survival depends on you transforming in the ways that we're describing. So all of these are really important levers, right? But what we focus on is the concept I'm going to introduce you to called transforming the deep design of companies. Because what I get is CEOs who tell me, hey, look, I'm trapped inside a structure that has its limits. I can't unlock the capital expenditure needed to drive the investment that's going to create the kind of things that we're talking about. I can't tolerate the slightly lower margins for a while to transition into this new business model. So I'm inherently seeing these limitations in the straitjacket of the 20th century corporate structures. And if we were able to start transforming businesses in the way I'm about to introduce it, then what ends up happening is, rather than pushing against regulations to get companies that lean into them, rather than holding back enlightened leaders, you get companies that open the way for them. Rather than setting targets like the science-based targets that we're seeing many global corporates set, but not take the action to actually meet them, we start to actually take that action. And we start to make the business case in much more ambitious ways, much more transformative ways. So in order to achieve all these other levers of change, we might need to transform some key elements of what we call the deep design business. So a part of this is going to be, how do we unlock the kind of actions that we're seeing here? Now, I'm not going to go through each of them, but hopefully some of the pictures speak for themselves, whether it's the modular product design, or it's circular fabrics that companies like Houdini are generating, or much more accessible services that are also using the waste of those services into other loops, or creating factories that are creating positive benefits for local ecology. All of these are possible. And on the socially distributive side, we're also starting to see all these new possibilities. Companies that are sharing power and value much more equitably with their workers, converting to things like employee ownership, which is growing at 37% per annum in the UK. There's a capital gains tax break here, which has been played a huge role in having a lot of owners sell their businesses to their workers rather than to private equity or other private owners. And that's skyrocketing, and that cuts across the political spectrum. I mean, Bright Blue, the centre-right think tank, just released a report on employee ownership and democratic governance in business. Across the entirety of the political spectrum, there's people piling into these sort of alternative models that are demonstrating they can do far more in pursuing socially and ecologically ambitious actions. So, what is this all about? How do we get to those ideas? How do we get to those actions? Well, the core is, we look at the purpose of the company, why it exists, what does it sell? Does it need to sell that, or does it need to sell something different? Its networks, its relationships with all of the stakeholders as part of the networks, including its own industry, local government, national government, its supply chain, its workers, its entire stakeholder group. And then its governance model. What's in the structures of the company that enable it to make decisions, pursue these ideas or hold back these ideas? The ownership model. What's its relationship with its owners, and does that help or hinder the kind of actions that we need from these corporates and businesses of all kinds? And lastly, its relationship with finance. What are the financial parameters? What are those expectations doing to enable or hold back the kind of actions that we want to see happen? And essentially, you look through this lens of enterprise design, you ask the question, are we stuck in the 20th century model, which is predated on the question of how much value can we extract through this enterprise, or are we moving towards the 21st century design of businesses, which is asking how many benefits can we generate through this enterprise? Let me give you some real examples. If you think about purpose, what's the purpose of a chocolate company? Well, for many, it is about maximizing shareholder returns. But for companies like Tony's, they're saying, well, for us, our purpose is to have 100% slave-free the norm in chocolate. It's about transforming the entire industry. What's interesting is that it doesn't just say that, it also follows suit with a whole host of very different supplier contracts that pass more value down to its farmers and have long-term partnerships, but also lock in the mission. It's got these guardian shares. That means that a group of individuals are making sure that the company cannot move away from its purpose. It's got special rights built into those guardian shares that keep it locked in. Next is networks. We're starting to see companies that build in those relationships into their structures. Companies like Enquente, which are saying, hey, look, we need our supply chain represented on our board. We need our workers represented on our board. We need our community organizations represented on our board. So we're starting to see these new models of networks emerging. Governance, and here I think a really interesting idea is emerging, such as the British company Faith in Nature, that has said, look, we're going to put nature on our board. If we're serious about what we say, why wouldn't we have one of our 11 board members representing the rights of nature? And they don't do it by saying, let's have an employee that sort of speaks up every now and again on the board, but they're saying, let's have Lawyers for Nature, an independent organization that holds that board seat. Fundamentally starts to shift the company's trajectory, starts to greenlight internal investments that enable it to pursue the kind of agenda we're talking about. Ownership. So companies like Patagonia, but a whole host of others, are looking at models of steward ownership, where there are different kind of share classes that are locking in the purpose of the company. or examples I mentioned like employee ownership, which is on the rise, community ownership of renewable energy, which is on the rise. So beginning to design ownership deliberately, saying let's not just rely on the 20th century models. If any of you work with startups and you think about, well, when they go to a venture capital fund, what's in the term sheet of that investment? What does that limit? What does that do to the company's ability to pursue ambitious agendas? And lastly, finance. And if you think of examples like Home.Earth, which is in the built environment industry, they've done an amazing job of saying, hey, look, 15% of our profits are going to go into making sure the tenants have an additional income out of this. They're making the tenants a co-owner of the business. That means that suddenly they're more likely to look after the common space. They're more likely to be long-term partners. They're more likely to create local communities that are coherent because they feel invested in a sense of ownership. And they've galvanized private finance as well. 85% of their profit still goes back to the general investors that have gone behind it. So they've said, we're going to take 25% of the profits, of which 15% goes to the tenants, and the rest we're going to use to enable the company to pursue a social and ecological agenda. So, when we talk about redesigning companies, what we're saying is that, hey, look, we need to do it to align the purpose of the company. We need to do it to enable the partnerships of the company, to channel investment, to lock in legacy, to make sure that the company is regenerative by design. So there's a strong list of considerations to say, if we are deliberate about the kind of enterprise designs and the diversity of enterprise designs we want in Oxfordshire, and across all the districts and all the areas and the entire region, we start to build a sense of public policy as well. Now, I'm going to jump straight to this before I go to the activities. I'm skipping over because the public policy question came up. And what we did is a bit of a mapping exercise of saying, what do local governments and other governments do to shape the design of the companies that populate their economies? And we found that there was essentially 4 groups of policy postures. One is recognizing their role, being very deliberate about that in local strategies, plans, sometimes in national constitutions. Using tacits of procurement, where those powers exist, to be able to deliberately favour the kind of enterprises that are going to do more of the heavy lifting of social equality, of ecological regeneration. Supporting the startup scene, of foster new businesses, using local space to give more opportunities for the startups that are being shaped in this way, and also helping to convert existing businesses, because this is happening en masse. There is a conversion happening to steward ownership, to employee ownership, and a whole host of diverse structures are beginning to emerge. And those structures might feel legalistically complicated to some, but actually it's the heart and soul of the hardware of the company. Like, how does it make decisions about investment? How does it make decisions about its practices? All of that is really up for grabs. And there are local authorities now being very deliberate about that, saying, look, we're going to find creative ways to foster particular kinds of businesses. Of course, a lot of this is about the social enterprise movement, the cooperative movement, the employee ownership sector, steward ownership models, but also many, many others that are beginning to spread out that are very diverse. So, I want to introduce all of that and then spend just a couple of minutes as we distribute these canvases, where I wanted you all to just think through what are the businesses you know of that operate in your area that might actually have an interesting element of design in them. It might be something in their ownership. It might be a community ownership model of renewable energy, or UPP on the Cowley Road, or might be a different social enterprise that has a different ownership structure or a governance model. It might be something else. It might be this organization that is hosting us today. It might be flows. It might be something else. There are so many different business structures, actually, of diversity in here. And also in this area, we're fortunate to have lots of catalytic organizations like ethics that provides finance to support these sorts of enterprise design. So I guess the question here is, think of a business that you think is important in the kind of strategy and direction that we need to see this region go, and can you write down 1 or 2 aspects of their design with that very rapid overview that we gave you, and also the final caveat. We normally do this in about 5 or 6 hours, by the way, guys. So if it feels rushed, it is. But you're so intelligent. I can tell from the look of, there's a sparkle in so many eyes there that I have full confidence that you'll be able to do this and more. So I'll give you an awkward silence for a minute and a half as you jot down a couple of thoughts on that canvas. Then we're going to have questions. Slide up behind me to show the kind of tools and resources across the field that we have at DoughnuteEconomics.org. So hopefully it's not a distraction, but we'd love to hear any reflections on the world of business. How do we reshape, transform the kind of businesses that populate this region to pursue the sort of vision we're talking about? Yes.
So Grant Hayward from OSEP. I think it's wonderful. I happen also to be co-chair of Be Local. So Oxfordshire was recognised as the first social enterprise county 10 years ago now. And we are, Oxfordshire Plus is a Be Local, so we are growing Be Locals. We've made great progress, but there's a huge shift and a great momentum. OSEP is driving that change as well. And I just wanted to do a bit of a plug for you because we've got a fantastic, relatively small transformation business locally in the cover market, New Underwear, which is a social enterprise. It was the highest on vehicle. But there you go, just sharing that. I think this place is a needed region for this, and I just think more to get behind the better. And most importantly, it's just business. If businesses aren't operating in some of the ways we suggest, then they want to work for organisations like that, or provide organisations like that. They want to invest. I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you.
Great soapbox, Grant. And to sort of, big up what you just said there in terms of PwC, did a survey ahead of the World Economic Forum of over 4,000 of the world's most powerful CEOs. What they found is that of those 4,000 plus CEOs, over half of them thought their business needs to be completely reinvented in the next decade. Completely reinvented. That's a scale of transformation that is staring global industry in the face. And this is really what we're trying to enable. If that's the kind of transformation we can't just be stuck with the straitjacket of 20th century corporate structures. These new models that are emerging are going to be critical to unlocking that action. So it's not about ideology or normative design of companies. It's about, what do we need to change in the structures and the governance and the board and the ownership, where profits go, so that those companies can transform and remain a part of the local economy. Tom.
Thanks. I was just going to make the point that I think Oxfordshire's got the amount of spin-outs that come from our universities, I think, is probably quite unique in terms of the percentage. And if you look at, you've all seen the graph of the number of spin-outs since OSD started, Oxford Science Enterprise started. And I think, part of our angle must be about how do we get them on board more in terms of the way they set up and spin out their companies. And I think we're pushing on more of an open door than we've ever had. But I think that's, for me, one of the ways that we get the biggest bang for the buck in some of the stuff you talked about, because the throughput of young, but not just necessarily young people wanting to do, I imagine more young people, there is a movement here already. The more we can kind of engage the universities and Oxford Science Enterprises and all of the organisations doing that, I think the better, and I think that should be a big focus of our efforts moving forward. And I think the Underwear Shop is a really good example, again, of public sector using its assets where we can to leverage those social enterprises, but we've got to find a way of doing more and streamlining that process of getting more access in to our spaces. And it's really tough, even though I've spoken about this a number of times, about how we do that while also managing the opportunity cost of potentially not making as much money, which we then divert into full services. So I think it's a challenge, but I think there are unique opportunities within the system now.
Absolutely, and the thing I'd add to that, Tom, is that if we start to see these models, I'm going to go back a couple of slides, if we start to see models on this side as an asset to the future of this county, then we start to see maybe some of those short-term sacrifices in revenue as an investment into something longer term. And maybe that unlocks some ideas, maybe it doesn't, but absolutely the use of the covered market feels like a really creative way to spur on. I mean, we've got the Skull Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. There's so many There's a huge social enterprise buzz in this city. Yes.
In terms of a local example of a company or a business, I think does a lot of this, I would say would be Blenheim Estate, which has transformed itself in recent years from being a traditional feudal ownership estate into something that still is that, but is much more community engaged. Apprenticeships are a big part of what it does. It's got its own social housing, and almost providing social housing ecologies as part of what it's doing. Not to forget solar, which is controversial. Steve Ball talked about, but you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs. So.
That's a helpful introduction. Last comment or question.
Oh gosh. Okay. So first, I just want to shout out to Bill's team at the County Council. So Bill, your colleagues Rachel and Sarah came to us in 2019, just after Cornwall published their approach, and they said we should do this. Just putting that context, and it's of course that's very hard. That's what I'm probably going to do. There we go. And one of the reasons we did that is so this is not a bunch of simple tools. It's how do we keep our eyes focused on what we can do locally, reflecting Bill's comments on our influence in this room and in this county, whilst focusing attention on other scale things. So for every underwear social enterprise in the market, how many pairs of pants are Tesco selling in the county, and how do you keep that focus on becoming interested in national and international scale regulatory political change, whilst keeping the enthusiasm for local change, which would make a difference and build a movement. That's where I think we struggle to keep attention on doing the right thing where we can, whilst others aren't necessarily doing that. Is that clear? Sorry.
It is, and I'm going to wrap up before I pass over to Paul on this. That actually, I think what you're underlining, many of us are underlining, is that there's multiple levers of transformation that we need to pursue, right? Like companies, big and small, need to be going in the kind of direction I mentioned, and we have a tool to help them do that. And I work with them. We have a cohort of organizations now around the world that are doing that too. But also, if we're thinking about business, a huge role for local governments. And these are just some of the case studies we drew out when we looked around the world and we worked with organizations of hey, there's really inspirational things going. There's an ownership hub in London, for instance, that's deliberately helping a democratization and a broadening of local ownership of businesses in that city. We're seeing those sorts of ideas emerge. And I guess the challenge I want to leave you all with is how do we up our ambition on some of this? There are some immediate things that we need to do. Yes, we need to get things delivered, services, products, things that need to happen. But alongside it, how do we retain a focus on the bigger transformations? Because we get these kinds of businesses populating Oxford and Oxfordshire and all the different areas around us, we start to really hum. The entire trajectory starts to rev up and it starts to accelerate towards the kind of economy that we're all talking about. So I'll end with that and pass the ball. Thanks.
Thank you. Can we first of all just start by giving a big round of applause? Thanks. Really motive through some deep thinking there. They came across really well, and it was very, very clear, concise, and compelling as well. So thank you so much for that. I just want to say a few parting words, and largely to just underline what Eric and Leonora shared with us. How can we now go where the energy is? How can we focus on the action and what we agree on to help ensure we can thrive and have a local economy within life support systems while respecting those social foundations? But as Eric and Leonora said, to see it as transformation, to see it as investment, and how do we enable that together and get that multiplier effect, get that cascade effect going in Oxfordshire. So there's plenty that we can do and build on the successes and the early relationship developments we've been making through the Inclusive Economy Partnership and this new sort of anchor network in particular. So I'm personally genuinely excited about how we can take some of this learning and some of the tools and apply it to decision making and ambition in Oxfordshire. And we will be sharing some slides and the resources and the links to the tools to help us take that forward. So last but not least, thank you to everyone else for coming this evening and for participating and for engaging so much. It's very much appreciated. And